Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program, To the Cloud, Look Before You Leap. I'm Julie Miller, Editor-in-Chief of Behavioral Healthcare. Today's program is sponsored by the Echo Group. Thank you to our sponsors and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, here are the housekeeping details. Each window on your screen can be moved by clicking and dragging, or enlarged and minimized by clicking on the icons in the top right corner of each window. Please use the Q&A area to the right of the slides to submit a question at any time. If you can't see this area, simply click on the red Q&A button. To download a copy of today's slides and other materials related to today's topic, please click the link in the Resources area in the lower left of your screen. If you have any technical issues during the program, please click the yellow Help button to troubleshoot the issue. You can also tweet during today's presentation using the Twitter widget by clicking on the blue Twitter icon at the bottom of your screen. Simply click the Post and Authorize buttons to log into your Twitter account and begin sharing at the hashtag #ToTheCloud. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, Joe Viger and Mike Kasson. Joe Viger joined Echo in 1999 with a varied behavioral healthcare background, including experience in case management, managing residential systems, and community-based treatment teams with diverse populations. Joe is currently the Vice President of Business Development for the Echo Group. Mike Kasson has nearly 20 years managing hosting environments and sensitive data hosting facilities. Over the last 10 years, he has worked as Director of IT for behavioral health software vendors, as well as behavioral health provider organizations. Currently, he oversees all aspects of IT for the Echo Group, including its cloud services, hosting facility, and staff. Thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today. And now, the audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Julie. This is Joe Viger. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. As Julie said, I'm the Vice President of Business Development for Echo. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Echo, we're a provider of electronic health record and billing software. We also offer billing and IT services. We were founded in 1982, and we've worked exclusively with behavioral health organizations over that time. Echo has customers in 40 states representing organizations from across the continuum of care. This includes mental health centers, substance use treatment facilities, organizations working with people who have developmental disability, and child and family service organizations. We're excited to speak to this topic today because it's an area that we do a lot of work with our customers on, and it's also an area that we do a lot of work with potential customers on as they evaluate our solution and really what is the best way to deploy a product. So we think that we have some things we can offer you today that way. Before we begin, one housekeeping point, as Julie mentioned, we are tweeting from the webinar today, and you can use the hashtag the cloud. And you can also see that throughout the presentation on the lower right corner of the footer. So we hope you're active that way. That would be exciting. So to the cloud. We've all heard, quote unquote, we need to be in the cloud. It's something that we continually are marketed to in a variety of industries. We hear a variety of messages about the cloud and to the point where it seems like it's the place you have to be. How can you not be in the cloud? To the cloud, that's where you need to go. And the marketing messages are many that way. There's nothing on your desktop. There's no expensive hardware to purchase. You can free up your time to focus on your core business instead of working on IT projects. Indeed, these are all real tangible benefits of adopting a cloud approach to address your organization's needs for an electronic health record. At the same time as we work with folks and help them understand what is the best approach to contracting and deploying an electronic health record billing system, we kind of have started to see an interaction evolve with potential new customers where different members of their leadership team look to their lead IT person, their CIO, their CTO, their IT director, and they'll say, we're going to be in the cloud, right? And that's a good question. That's a reasonable question. And at the same time, I often wonder when that question is posed, what kind of insight comes with that question? What kind of considerations validate that assumption by, say, a clinical director or a business manager. We're going to be in the cloud, right? Is that an informed question? Is that a question that has some meaning to that person? Or is it because we are so inundated with messages about the cloud today? And in that way, while cloud presents many benefits, as I've stated, for a business, which ultimately our customers are, even though they are mission-driven, private, nonprofit, behavioral health organizations, moving to the cloud isn't always a no-brainer. There are some concrete things that we think we can help you evaluate and consider to make an informed decision to move to the cloud or not. There are still salient reasons to have an on-premise solution. And for us, as a vendor who offers both on-premise solutions and cloud options, with a lot of expertise moving through this process with customers, we think that's really what counts, which is making a good informed decision for you as a customer, as a person adopting an enterprise-wide software product and evaluating your staffing needs, evaluating your budget needs, that you make the right decision for you that's unique to you. So what I'd like to do next is just define a couple of terms that we'll be using today. And these are just general terms we'll use, and in a moment I'll turn it over to Mike, and he'll give us a little deeper understanding of some of these. But specifically, we want to talk a little bit about a couple of terms that we'll use interchangeably. One is on-premise or self-hosted. And when we're using that term, we're really referring to any solution where an organization hosts a software product that they own on a technical infrastructure that they own and manage and have responsibility for. So you've purchased a software license, you've purchased the required server technology or whatever you need to do to deploy that application, and you administer that infrastructure and that software product by yourself, of your own staff, of your own resources. We'll also use the term cloud frequently, as we already have. And really, we're using the cloud as a generic term in this presentation to speak to any approach to using a software product that's facilitated by the Internet. And that infrastructure is managed by a third party. There are a couple of different variations of that we'll speak to generically in the presentation today. One is hosting. And in a hosting situation, we're typically speaking of a situation where you're contracting with a third party to provide an internet-based access to a license that you own. So you've purchased a software license for an electronic health record from a vendor, but you don't want to necessarily be in the business of hosting that license yourself for your users to access and do their job. So you contract out with a third party, some sort of server farm or what have you. And lastly, another term you've probably heard before is software as a service. It's a very common term you hear today. And we'll be speaking to software as a service in the context of this presentation as a situation where you're contracting with a third party, with a vendor, for the use of a software product available through the Internet, and they're managing all back-end infrastructure. And that's a little different than purchasing a license. In a software as a service arrangement, typically what you see in the marketplace is you're using the software license for a specified contract term, say 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And in that situation, you don't actually own that license in perpetuity. That would be a situation where you purchase the license if you had a perpetual license ownership. So software as a service has that distinction to it. So those rough terms defined, let me move forward here, and Mike is going to talk to you a bit about some of these a little more in depth.
Thanks, Joe, and hello, everyone. So to speak a little bit to Joe's point about the definitions here of on-premise solutions or self-hosting, traditionally this has been the historical way for many organizations. It is still the most prevalent way that software is distributed. So to give you an example of that, in many environments today, there still is the traditional servers in the server rooms and the devices, whether it's tablets, laptops, or smartphones out in the rest of the organization. Essentially what that means when you're looking at self-hosting or on-premises, you own the software. You have the staff that is maintaining the infrastructure, whether that's the networks, the servers, the devices that your employees or end users are using. You likely own the infrastructure itself, meaning your network devices, the cabling, etc. This assumes that you have the internal resources and infrastructure in place. You also have the overall responsibility for maintaining that equipment, for maintaining that environment. You may take care of the security yourself, your disaster recovery, and your managed backups are likely self-hosted and handled by your IT environment. So some of the differences here when you talk about self-hosting versus cloud solution. Cloud solution is a very common and popular buzzword. As a matter of fact, it was interesting over the weekend, the New York Times did an actual lead story on cloud solutions. And what's happening now in this market is that it's beginning to really pick up steam. You're seeing hardware sales drop. So as an example, last year hardware sales rose 3.4% roughly. That sounds okay. However, keeping in mind that the previous year they were at 7.4%. So what's happening as the hardware sales are decreasing, the market for growth in the cloud has actually increased 25% last year, according to a large Gartner study. So you're seeing more of the cloud infrastructures going up. You're hearing about it more often in the media. And the question is why? And we'll see if we can answer that a little bit for you here. But there are several different options when you talk about cloud solutions. One of those that's most prevalent today is IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service. And essentially what that is that's the physical components, whether it's or virtual, whether it's the network, the storage itself, or the servers. So essentially what you're doing is contracting out for infrastructure as opposed to having that in-house. That is the most prevalent of the different options that are available for cloud solutions. Some of the other ones, platform as a service, that's essentially where you're outsourcing or you're leasing is a better way of putting it perhaps, the infrastructure and the servers that you need, whether it's database servers or web servers to run your software. Software as a service, this is probably one of the more common ones that you may be familiar with already. If you have, for example, Amazon Web Services, which hosts, for example, Pinterest, Netflix, if you're utilizing that, that's software as a service. It's often accessed over the internet. The software itself is not installed locally. Office 365 for any organizations using that, that's a pretty good example also of software as a service. There's also other smaller models that you'll hear of that aren't in the slide deck, such as hardware as a service or everything as a service, where you're actually everything is completely outsourced to that provider. The nice part about any of these cloud solutions is typically you have the ability to scale, and what that means is you have the ability to ramp up or ramp down accordingly. So for example, if you have employees coming or employees going and you may or may not need the same infrastructure or the same software, you can easily scale. In other words, the flexibility is there to turn those up or down on demand. So with that, I'm going to change it back over to Joe here, and he's going to speak a little bit about the value of that.
So what we want to talk a little bit about is value. I think as we consider cloud solutions and on-premise solutions, different organizations interpret the value of those solutions in different ways, particularly in different moments of the organization's life cycle. So for example, time. It's a limiter for us all in our lives and our businesses and the clinical work we do in so many ways. And as you look at these different types of solutions, what is your value on time? Do you need it fast? Do you have time to implement something yourself? Expertise. Do you have the expertise internally? Do you need to build it? Money. Do you have the ability to make an upfront investment or not? Peace of mind. You know, sometimes I know when I contract a service out or contract something out, as simple as a project on my house, I do it because it gives me peace of mind. I know I'm not going to screw it up, frankly, and so I don't put on my own roof on my house because it concerns me to do that. So again, as an organization looks at evaluating these different solutions, you got to evaluate the different points of value that your organization brings to the table. What do you need out of this solution? Do you need it to be fast? Do you need to quickly bring additional expertise to the table you can't develop yourself? Do you need to increase your organizational efficiency by focusing your internal resources somewhere else other than the deployment of a software product? Now we're going to take a deeper look at some of the different considerations that relate to evaluating these points of value.
So talking a little bit here about some of the technical considerations when you're evaluating, does it make sense to self-host or have the software on-premise versus outsourcing to a cloud provider? One of the things that you really need to take a look at is what you already have in place. What's your existing infrastructure or environment look like? Do you have those skills in-house to maintain the infrastructure that you already have? Keeping in mind that that's going to require putting some additional funds into the infrastructure if you're going to be adding additional software. Now that may mean you may need more bandwidth for what you already have in place in your organization. You may need additional servers, additional drive space for your backups, etc. The device and the location independence is something to consider also. When you're comparing that against a cloud solution where typically you're not managing any infrastructure whatsoever. That's all been outsourced. And when I talk about outsourced, that's essentially what you're doing is if you compare the analogy to an automobile where you're leasing an automobile in a cloud, for example, versus purchasing. But one of those things to keep in the back of your mind is, in-house, it's not, can I use the existing infrastructure I have, or is it something where I need to allocate more resources? Keeping in mind that, a lot of hardware, for example, has a definitive lifetime, typically, 4 years, for example, for your servers. So you say, geez, well, maybe I do have what I need right now, but, compare the cost of upgrading that server or that infrastructure 3 or 4 years down the road to what you may pay for a cloud-based solution. There's also some tax implications to keep in mind. For the most part, a lot of hardware can be depreciated over a period of a few years. Weigh that versus the cost of what it would take, in a cloud-based solution. Another technical consideration when you're comparing the two is to talk about bandwidth. Do you have the bandwidth that's available for a cloud-based solution, or do you have to invest some money into that? So what that would mean is, your end users or your employees accessing the cloud-based solution, whether it's remotely or through one of your offices, is that going to require additional bandwidth for what you already have? So one of the things is, too, if you're looking at a budget, your capital budget, does it make sense for you to look at buying your licenses to buy down your operating costs? Keep in mind from a technical perspective that may make some sense for you. In other words, do you have to put additional funds into that budget itself to buy those licenses and compare that against the cloud solution? So talking a little bit about the cloud solution and the on-premise solution in terms of your staff, what do you already have in-house? Do you have those skills and that expertise in-house to manage that software that you're going to look at implementing or distributing? Do you need to recruit, hire, or train the existing staff? You may have to put some additional funds into the staff itself if you're looking at experiencing those growths. The skills that you'd be looking at, for example, you may need an initial database administrator. You may need an additional network engineer or a systems administrator versus a cloud-based solution where essentially you're having those, they're going to be handling that for you, where you don't have to worry about hiring, training, or retaining those employees. So essentially what you're doing is you're not worrying about managing the staff in-house, but you're managing a contract in a cloud solution versus self-hosted. So some of the concrete tasks that you'd want to consider too on premises, the backups, are they does the staff have the skills to manage the backups, apply the updates to the operating systems, ensure that they have the disaster recovery plan covered and in place. So those are the type of things you want to weigh back and forth when you're looking at the cloud versus a self-hosted solution. You're also, you want to clearly define the ownerships of those activities if you're going to take that in-house. So perhaps, do they have the bandwidth? Do they have the time to manage the additional platform in-house versus outsourcing that? And how difficult is it for you if you need to recruit and retain that talent?
If I can jump in here quick too, Mike, I think one of the things that's interesting here for me is a less technical person than Mike is just as an organization, do you want to be managing a result with a contractor, or do you want to be building infrastructure and staffing up? And we'll talk a bit more about that in some future slides here that we're going to cover with some other considerations. But I think that's a big distinction, and kind of knowing who you are as an agency really matters at that point.
Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point, Joseph. So when you're looking at contracts, if you get to that point, the cloud versus self-hosted, one of the things with the cloud solution is you really need to define who owns that data in the contract itself. It's very important, and that's one of the bigger things that organizations are typically concerned about is, whose data is it at that point? Well, it's clearly your data, but you need to make sure that that's defined in that contract itself. Versus, when you have your data in-house, it's pretty clear. You have the control of the data. You own the data. If there's any issues with that, you're ultimately responsible for solving that. What the contract term is in-house. You need to define that clearly if you're looking at a contract with a cloud provider. You'll hear some common terms thrown around, things like the nines. The nines are, what's the uptime? Is it 4 nines, 5 nines? And what that means is, what is the guaranteed service level agreement with the provider in terms of the network response time, in terms of the applications being available. So those have to really be hammered out carefully when you're looking at a cloud-based solution. And again, it also always goes back to the ownership of that data. You've got to clearly define that. You're also looking at multiple terms for the years. Are you looking at 2 or 3 years, 4 years versus a shorter contract if you're to purchase the software and host that internally? And another thing that comes up often is, if this does not work out, how do I get my data back? And then more importantly is, what form do I get my data back? So as an example of that, if your database has traditionally been with one provider, whether it's an Oracle or a Microsoft back-end database, will you get it back in that format or a format that you can use in-house? So defining those end-of-term conditions in terms of the period of time in that contract that the organization that's providing the cloud services has to return that data to you needs to be clearly spelled out also. You'll hear things in the contract, or you'll see things in a lot of contracts about mean time between failures, MTBF, meaning if this piece of hardware or the server that your data resides on goes down or becomes inoperable, what's the mean time between failure, or the MTTR, which is mean time to resolution? How quickly can I get that server and that data back online? So you need to, take a look at that versus in-house. How long would it take you in-house to pull this back online, and then get that into the contract? What does your organization say? What is the uptime requirements for your company? Does it need to be up 99.x% of the time? And if so, compare that to what you would get in the contract.
And I think either way, in terms of that uptime, another interesting aspect of that, because you're really comparing taking responsibility for this yourself versus contracting with someone else to have that responsibility. So as you talk about the uptime responsibility you want defined in a contract for cloud, and if you're pondering doing it yourself, you also have to reflect back, okay, can I maintain that kind of uptime? Is that something I can ensure given my set of skills, my hardware platform, my internet connectivity, et cetera, et cetera? Do I have the ability to deliver that level of reliability. There's almost a self-contract component to it at that point.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And one of the things to think about is, your existing internet service provider, what's their response time? What's their guaranteed uptime? What have you already contracted for versus, what you might get in a cloud-based solution? Same thing with your servers. Do you have a support agreement with the provider, Dell, HP, whoever that may be, to be on site within 4 hours or next business day or whatever the case may be? Compared the cost of that to what the cost you would negotiate in a contract with the cloud provider.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about some fiscal considerations, and I can tell you as we talk to folks who are starting to look at different ways to address electronic health record needs, what we see is this is often the tip of the spear, that this is the first thing people say is, how much would it cost for me to buy a license, and how much would it cost for me to use your product as a software as a service solution in the cloud? And that's a reasonable question. We work hard to give people a good answer to that. And at the same time, we've covered a lot of other bases already. We have a few more things we're going to look at, and it really is only part of the story, but it's definitely an important part. So as we look at on-premise versus cloud solutions, one point that always leads is in an on-premise solution, you're going to have front-loaded costs. Most of the time, if you're purchasing a software license, you're going to pay for that license the day you receive it because you're taking that product into your house, and that's typically the way those contracts are worded. You probably also are going to have some front-loaded costs as it relates to infrastructure and potentially staffing, as Mike talked about. So if you have a need to bring servers up to a certain spec, or if you have a need to enhance your virtualization environment, or you have a need to expand your internet connectivity and the size of your bandwidth to address connecting multiple locations when you're doing your own on-premise rollout. Those are all going to be front-loaded costs to get you out of the gate and making your end users happy. In a cloud solution, typically, those front-loaded costs are far less. We'll say there's a lower barrier to entry to that cloud solution. And here again, Mike referenced an automobile analogy earlier where you might purchase a vehicle versus lease a vehicle. It's not that similar. A lot of times you can move into a lease with a lot lower front-loaded costs than you can if you move into a purchase. And that analogy applies here. You have a lower barrier to entry to the cloud solution typically because you're entering into some sort of time-based contract where you have some sort of time-based payment, whether that be annual or quarterly or what have you, to the SaaS provider, and away you go. So the comeuppance of that really depends on how your organization is structured. If you have that money sitting there, we talk to a lot of people who will say we have X amount of dollars to spend by the end of the fiscal year based on a grant. Well, in those situations, you might have the ability to invest in the front-loaded costs, and that might make sense. The other thing to consider in this environment is if you're in an on-premise approach, you're going to need to budget and plan for periodic upgrades and make sure that's part of the calculation of the investment you're going to make. Mike referenced earlier kind of an industry standard timeline of looking at server lifespan of a 4-year cycle. And we all know that on a regular basis, Microsoft is going to refresh their operating systems and their database systems if you're functioning on a Microsoft license, for example. And those would be other upgrade investments you'd need to make over time in an on-premise environment and having to deal with that yourself, as well as the staff expertise to make that all work well. In the cloud environment, those things are typically the responsibility of the cloud provider, and that isn't something you're going to need to concern yourself with. It will be folded into that cost over time. Now, the other part of that for the cloud is that creates a certain predictability in the payments. Again, you have a 3-year contract, let's say, for X amount of dollars per year for a given term. You know that's what it is. You can build it into your budget for that time period, and you know how that's going to work. You don't have to worry about the fact that a server has a hard drive failure and how to deal with that financially, or that you have some other issue happening with your infrastructure that you are on the hook to fix in the cloud situation. One of the important considerations we hear folks talk about and try and help people think about is the distinction between capital budget and operating budget. And this gets a little back to the front-loaded cost, lower barrier of entry type ideas, where if you're making a decision to move to an on-premise solution, a self-managed solution, a lot of folks look at the impact of that on their capital budget. And if they have the ability and the monies in a capital budget to do that, that solution often works well for them, and that might be one of the reasons they choose it. Again, I referenced earlier having certain amount of funds you have to expend by a fiscal date because of a grant term or something like that. Or maybe it's because you have a particularly effective fundraising organization and they build capital funds for you, and those capital funds kind of drive a lot of your investment, which is different than your operating budget. Some folks don't have the ability to assume a new line item into an operating budget, which is how a cloud solution typically is funded, is an ongoing operating expense, and you just can't do it. It isn't the way your budget works, and those are important decision points for people as they look at which way to go, cloud versus on-premise, as they look at the financial considerations. It's not just a dollar sign; it's those two types of ideas.
Yeah, I might also add to what Joe said about the fiscal considerations too. Is downtime. In other words, if you were hosting the software, the applications internally on site, what kind of downtime could you afford versus the cloud solution where you have that in the contract? That's something to consider. So typically, there might be a cost of X amount per hour, as they do for many businesses. They've already figured those numbers out. This is if we're down for 1 hour, 12 hours, 24 hours, it's going to cost us X amount to pull this back online, versus the cloud provider, where there may be something in the contract that says if you're down for this much, you're going to be reimbursed X amount for this amount of time. So something to weigh back and forth between self-hosted and the cloud provider.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. I want to take a little bit of a look at what I'll call flexibility and control. And this really gets more to kind of the personality of your organization and how you like to manage your organization, and what makes you feel comfortable fronting your board, fronting your community as you manage your operations. So in an on-premise solution, the investment is purely controlled by you because you control the pieces, parts of it. You purchase the software license, you purchase the servers, you make the decision about who provides your internet tunnel, et cetera, which is very much in contrast to a cloud solution where you sign a contract with a cloud provider, and that cloud provider, therefore, is in control of everything from the internet outward of your organization, whereas you're only in control of the internet line through to the end user machine in that circumstance. Now, the comeuppance of that, I think we often see for people is people will say to us, okay, well, I don't want to be on the hook, if you will, to provide you X amount of dollars a quarter or annually in a cloud contract. I want to give you this money to buy a license, and I will control the funds I expend towards my IT solution over time after that. And it really is just that. It's control. So, for example, if you've purchased a license for X amounts of dollars and you decide not to upgrade a server in a given year, you can do that. Your mission calls for you not to allocate funds into IT for a certain year or for a certain time frame, you can do that. Now, that may have other implications, and that's probably another webinar, the implications of inadequate IT investment on a behavioral health organization. But the reality is sometimes you've got to make those hard decisions to maintain service levels, to maintain your mission. And, we understand that happens every day in America as behavioral health organizations wrestle with delivering services to their clients. Again, in a cloud solution, you're going to have a contract for a term that you are responsible for. And generally those contracts, do create a situation where you're committing to pay people for that term of the contract. Mike talked a little bit about physical location. If you're in a situation where you're in a highly liquid organization, you're planning big growth, you're planning on moving out of your existing buildings, you're planning on changing locations, you're planning on expanding throughout a state or expanding multi-states, the ability to scale on demand is certainly a strong advantage for the cloud solution. It's really just contracting for additional licenses and away you go. Now, sometimes in a self-hosted on-premise type solution, those physical location changes, those scaling locations can be time intensive. It depends a little bit on the technical infrastructure you run on. You certainly can roll out applications yourself in a way that's pretty much identical to what the cloud provider is doing. And if you build up that infrastructure and that expertise, it's going to minimize the time and efficiency effects of physical location changes. But it is a different ball of wax. You have a different level of responsibility, certainly, as you make those kinds of changes if you're hosting your own application. This is one of the more interesting elements of this whole question to me. As you probably have gathered, Mike is somebody with a lot of technical expertise and can talk to you in a very deep way about the infrastructure and the servers and how to make a cloud solution work and evaluating the cloud solution versus an on-premise solution, et cetera. Whereas my background is much more working in provider organizations and consulting with those organizations. And so for me, I think about in this era that we're currently in of healthcare reform, of meaningful use expansion, of integration, an introduction of integrated care, and really seeing a lot of very quick-moving and game-changing developments in how behavioral healthcare organizations work. And hopefully a lot of you are reflecting on those right now. That are happening in your environment, whether they're state-based or accreditor-based or just the fact that healthcare is changing and evolving. As an organization, I think you're always evaluating, how do I stay viable? How am I a good partner in my community? How am I maximizing my opportunity to execute on my mission? How am I maximizing my opportunity to deliver services to my clients? How am I maximizing my opportunity to be viable long-term to support the clients that get services from me and the staff that deliver them? And it's that period of time, I think, that we're in right now that really means that really informs IT decisions, because IT is the platform that a lot of this happens under. So for example, if you think your strategic vision, your strategic approach to maintain the viability of your behavioral health center is going to have a lot to do with partnering with the local hospital and being interoperable with their EHR, with their electronic health record. What are the opportunity costs to having a cloud solution versus an on-premise solution? So for example, if I am a director at a mental health center and I'm reaching out to the local hospital to try to be their partner, try to trade information with them electronically, et cetera, what if I haven't built out the infrastructure and expertise in the IT area? Can I talk their language with their IT folk? Can I engage them as a viable, credible partner to do that? I may be able to do a real good job of speaking to them about the services and the mission-driven reasons we should have a partnership. But if they perceive that I can't come to the table with the right amount of IT horsepower, both in terms of infrastructure and intellectual expertise, am I marginalized to take advantage of that opportunity and that partnership? So it's less a technological consideration as it is a strategic kind of agency vision, mission consideration. So if you have built out that infrastructure internally because you host your own application, if you have built out the expertise, are you more in a position to go to those partners and say, hey, here's our CIO, here's our IT director, we use this system, we know you use that system. You can talk about the various protocols to communicate. You can talk in a deep way about CCDs or continuity of care documents. You can talk in a deep way about the bandwidth required or the encryption required, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that doesn't mean you have to build it out if that's your strategic goal. There are other ways to do that, obviously. The question becomes, okay, maybe you do want to go to a cloud solution because it makes a lot of sense for you for a lot of reasons. But it still means you need to consider what kind of expertise you need in-house from an IT standpoint to pursue those partnerships. The other question that gets raised at that point too is, what kind of partner is your cloud provider? If you're going to be in a highly partnered healthcare environment, as many of our customer organizations are, is your cloud provider going to be a good partner with you in that process? Are they the kind of people that will get on the phone with you and talk to that local hospital to help everyone better understand how you can work in an interoperable environment? How can you carry on that dialogue? And is there an opportunity cost in not being able to carry on that dialogue? Where does that leave your organization? Where does that leave your strategic vision? Something that we've worked up that you can find in the resources area of the webinar interface and also at the URL you see on the screen is an on-premise and cloud cost comparison calculator. Now, what you'll find when you take a look at this, if you choose to, is really an open spreadsheet that we've pre-populated with some standard information. I wouldn't take any of this to the bank. I think you're going to have local conditions that change the price of the hardware, change the price of the software, et cetera. And you're also going to have some considerations that are unique to you. Again, circling back to the idea of value, what things are really going to need to appear here in a spreadsheet. But it is pre-populated with formulas that will allow you to do a comparison of upfront costs, monthly costs, and ongoing costs, and also help you look at a useful life term. You see in the quick screenshot example here, there's in the middle of the screen, it says estimated useful life, and it's 48 months. And we did that based on the 4-year server cycle. But you have the ability to edit that number in the spreadsheet, and that will change the calculation for you. So if you wanted to look at a 3-year term versus a 5-year term versus a 10-year term, you can do that. So bear in mind, you can break the formulas in the spreadsheet if you change it around too much. But we wanted to offer you a tool that gave you a good head start in comparing costs. We talked about that a couple slides ago, and we understand there's a fine-grained kind of accounting process to go through that way, looking at costs over time. In our experience, when we look at perpetual license ownership versus a SaaS solution, we generally see a little bit of a break point at around 5 years where the on-premise solution starts to look more financially attractive than the cloud solution. But again, there's a lot of local conditions to that, having to do with your hardware and your infrastructure and the different things you need to do to kind of staff up and maintain that. But that is a concrete resource we have for you, again, out in the resource section of the webinar interface and at the URL you see here. So we hope you take advantage of that, and we find that useful.
Okay, so we've put together some considerations here that Joe's going to talk a little bit about first, what's going on in terms of what makes sense for your organization versus what may make sense for another organization.
So, as you might have noticed as we moved through the webinar, we're kind of holding some things up to the light and looking at it from both sides. And I think what you also may be identifying with is sometimes it appears that something is both positive and negative. So for example, I think on one of the slides, the technical slide, it might have said security responsibility is a significant issue for both an on-premise and a cloud solution. And again, it's for different reasons. It gets back to that point of value. It might be a strong value of your organization to say, yes, I want the responsibility to make sure my data is secure. I am a private nonprofit in my community. I have a responsibility to ensure that security, and I want my staff managing it, and I want the server downstairs in our server room. Other folks feel like, you know what, there's no way I could ever create an environment as secure as a credible hosting facility, and therefore I'm going to hire that expertise out because they're going to give me a more secure solution than I could ever build myself. And in that way, as we look at this, we kind of think one person's pro is another person's con, and that's okay. We understand that, but it gets back to that slide we showed earlier about value. What is the value for you, and what are your concerns? What do you bring to the table as you begin to evaluate this? What kind of expertise? What kind of skills? What kind of resources? So don't get confused by that. If you start to realize, gee, there's feels like there's mixed messages here. I don't think there is. I think it's just the fact that people have different things that make a consideration important for them. They have different perspectives, different values. So tying up, we've put together some questions. Again, they're not the be-all, end-all, but they get to, I think, the heart of the matter of a variety of things we talked about today and a variety of things that we think your organization needs to look at if you're considering, should I look at an on-premise solution or a cloud solution?
So what we did here is we put together some questions just to get the conversation perhaps started internally for your organization is, how do you define your strategic priorities? What are you looking at in terms of the cost versus return on investment, bringing this in-house or outsourcing to a cloud provider? What makes more sense for you? Does it make more sense to put those funds into the software or the hardware internally? Or does it make more sense to finance that over time, depending on what your budget, considerations are? As Joe had pointed out a little while ago, is the organization looking at changing? Are you going through an expansion period where it may make more sense to utilize those funds to quickly ramp up or scale with a cloud provider versus putting that infrastructure and software in place in-house? And again, what kind of partnership, as Joe said, are you looking for? And what role does the technology play? And what that means is, are you looking at hardware as a service versus investing additional funds internally to host that software? Or are you looking for a software as a service provider that's going to simply manage the aspects of those particular hardware software applications? What do you have internally? Do you have that IT staff in-house that can manage this? What's their workload now? Do they have the bandwidth to actually go ahead and deploy whatever software applications you're looking at? And if not, what does it cost you to pull that talent in-house versus outsourcing that to a cloud provider? Do you have what's necessary now in-house? Is it simply a matter of upgrading the existing infrastructure, whether it's a server or the bandwidth or your internet provider? Do you have what it takes to put that solution together versus going with a cloud provider and the costs associated with doing that? What makes more sense for your organization? So to sum this up a little bit on this particular slide, you may want to go through and rate the priorities here in terms of operational or resource allocation or tactical, and compare them to the options that you would get outsourcing that with a cloud provider.
Thanks, Mike. So that brings us to the end of the presentation that we prepared for you. Again, in the end, we think there's still a lot of viability for both an on-premise solution and a cloud solution, and there's real strong reasons why one organization might pursue either or. We really see it as our role to help folks understand that and define that and help them do a good job evaluating what's the best approach. We hope you guys found some of the points we put out today helpful. We hope you identified with some of the things we said and you found some kernels that help you think a little differently about what you might have previously seen just as I have to be in the cloud. It's a no-brainer. That there are some other considerations. And we hope you might also have identified with some things outside the pure financial analysis, because while that financial analysis is important, I do think there are other considerations that can have meaningful impact in your organization if you take the time to look at them as to how you're addressing these needs to roll out an EHR and billing system today. With that, I think we're going to move to questions.
Great. Thank you both again for the good information. We'll now move on to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. As a reminder to our audience, please use the Q&A widget below the slides on your screen to submit a question at any time. And we do have a few questions that have come in already. First of all, could you speak to client confidentiality concerns for organizations interested in cloud solutions? For example, what about liability?
In what respect are we talking about the liability?
That wasn't specified. This came from the audience. So client confidentiality is always top of mind for them, and I think this speaks to the security of the systems.
Well, that's actually a good question too. In terms of the security and liability, that would be hammered out actually in the service level agreement or the contract with a cloud provider. Now, again, depending on what your organization's policies and procedures are, that can actually be added to that contract or negotiated into that contract too. So that's just something to think about.
Yeah,
okay,
I think it's. Sorry, this is Joe, and I was just going to expand a little bit to say I think it's difficult for us to speak to liability specifically just because it's ultimately a legal question. I can tell you, obviously, that many healthcare organizations today are using cloud resources. We actually just saw a really interesting infographic from HIMSS that talked about the adoption of cloud tools in healthcare, and it was significant. If you're a Twitter user, you can find it on the HIMSS Twitter feed this week. If not, I'm sure their website would have it as well. So I think properly implemented, and as Mike said, properly substantiated in a contract, your security questions are generally addressed.
Okay, and to clear that up a little bit, the security of client data, what kind of liability would the organization have if that data is not secure?
And what kind of liability would the organization have if the data is not secure? It depends on the federal mandate that perhaps that organization falls under. So, for example, a lot of the organizations we deal with fall under the HIPAA mandate. So yes, there's a large consideration. So whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, GLIBA, any of those, I mean, that's something you got to consider and make sure that that gets into the contract.
The other part of a lot of the relationships that people create around well, any sort of software these days, and as it relates to EHR, whether it's cloud or on-premise, is a business associates agreement, and there are frequently aspects of that that help define liability points for client confidentiality. Again, liability ultimately is a legal question, and it's difficult for us to provide official comment on legal questions. But certainly as you dig into contracts, you're going to see it addressing those areas, and you're going to need to determine with your legal counsel if that's adequate protection for you.
Okay, here's a more technical question for you. What is the lowest bandwidth cloud services require?
Well, good point. And one of the things to think about is what exactly, what applications would you be utilizing? So, for example, email may be lower bandwidth utilization versus a full desktop. So, for example, if you are utilizing an entire desktop with numerous applications in a higher resolution, you're going to utilize more bandwidth. Most providers can give you, and we do the same for companies that we deal with, can give you a general idea for their individual applications. But it's really no different than perhaps being at home and maybe you use a Hotmail account or a Yahoo account or something like that, where the bandwidth utilization is very minor versus bringing an entire desktop with numerous applications under a higher resolution down to the screen. It's not just a question of bandwidth, though. I need to point that out. It's also a question of latency. And for those who aren't familiar with latency, latency is the delay between point A and point B. So on the Internet, every time you go to a website, for example, or with a cloud provider, the provider's location, you're actually passing through multiple what they call routers on the Internet. So bandwidth is important. You have to have adequate bandwidth, but the latency, as anything moves between one point and another, is a consideration. Typically, the further away you are, the higher the latency.
Okay, and another technical question. Does it matter if you use tablets versus smartphones versus workstations versus laptops for choosing one or the other?
No, and actually, what it goes back to is the application provider, the cloud provider themselves, what they support. Today, for the most part, as long as you're able to the bandwidth and you have the resolution available to that device, whether it's a laptop, a computer, a smartphone, etc. Today, more and more the providers themselves are offering the applications through any one of these number of devices. So,
just to join on that, I think, and elaborate a little on what Mike said, I agree with Mike that it is less that generally that isn't a concern. It ultimately becomes, I think, more a concern of the product you're using through the cloud. So more of that story is cloud providers can deploy cloud solutions to all those devices. But then the question becomes, is the software you're using optimized for that device? And is that a good device to use that software on? That isn't much about the cloud technology. It is about the solution you're trying to use. So just understand that distinction. It might be a cloud solution, but that doesn't mean it's a good solution over a smartphone. The software you're getting just might not be optimized for a smartphone. It's not the cloud's issue.
Right, and that goes, as Joe pointed out, he's correct. And that also is a question that you would want to pose to the software provider.
Okay, and then another question, is disaster recovery available in the cloud as a standard component?
Yeah, for many organizations, that's one of the top questions, because perhaps they don't have a DR plan or they don't have a DR strategy already in place. For many cloud providers, that is an option. However, it is something that has to be, it depends on the provider itself, and it's also something that you have to negotiate in the contract. Keeping in mind, if you're looking at disaster recovery, again, you want response times. You want to know how long it's going to take till that environment is brought back online. And that's something that's, assuming that the provider you choose goes with, offers that option, that's something that you want to make sure gets into the contract. So that's one of the things, too, versus on-premise with a cloud provider. On-premise, do you have that DR plan already in place, where with a cloud provider, typically they can point you in a direction if you don't already have that DR plan implemented on your side. Something to consider.
Something we're also seeing in our customer base is, we have customers that have been customers of ours for 20 years or more, and they're generally an on-premise solution because 20 years ago we didn't really talk about cloud solutions, and they've built out infrastructure, et cetera. But as the world has evolved and we've evolved our business, and I think this is the case of a lot of folks, we've started to offer not just a pure SaaS solution, but a variety of cloud services. And so there are different aspects of the technical solution that we contract out to fill gaps or take over certain parts of our customers' operations they don't want to deal with anymore. Database backups, server maintenance, things like that. And DR may be one of those things. And this isn't unique to Echo. So while I'm using us as an example, it's generally available out there. That you might pursue cloud solutions for different pieces, parts of your technical solution, even if you do generally run an on-premise app.
Yeah, and that's true. And so a cloud solution can simply augment what you already have in place, meaning so for perhaps you already have the software in-house, you're happy with it, you've got the staff, the resources, the infrastructure, et cetera. However, you are looking to meet the disaster recovery requirements of a federal mandate like HIPAA, for example. So, yeah, that's always an option.
All right, and that's all the time we have for questions today. But thank you both again for the great information. I want to thank Joe Viger and Mike Kasson once again for their excellent presentation. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, the Echo Group, for making today's program possible. And finally, thanks so much to each of you in our audience for participating today. We hope you'll join us in the future for another behavioral healthcare webinar. This concludes today's presentation.